Greetings and welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm glad you could be here. Before we begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons, and maybe consider dropping a comment down below. And if you're so inclined, go and check us out over on Patreon. Lots of cool stuff going on there. Okay, on tap today we have the finale of Edgar Rice Burroughs' immortal classic, A Princess of Mars. So, on with the story. A Princess of Mars, a story by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Episode 14, Chapters 26, 27, and 28. Chapter 26, Through Carnage to Joy. Sometime later, Tarkus and Kantos Khan returned to report that Zodanga had been completely reduced. Her forces were entirely destroyed or captured, and no further resistance was to be expected from within. Several battleships had escaped, but there were thousands of war and merchant vessels under guard of Thark warriors. The lesser hordes had commenced looting and quarreling amongst themselves, so it was decided that we collect what warriors we could, man as many vessels as possible with Zodangan prisoners, and make for Helium without further loss of time. 5 hours later, we sailed from the roofs of the dock buildings with a fleet of 250 battleships, carrying nearly 100,000 green warriors, followed by a fleet of transports with our thoats. Behind us, we left the stricken city in the fierce and brutal clutches of some 40,000 green warriors of the lesser hordes. They were looting, murdering, and fighting amongst themselves. In 100 places they applied the torch, and columns of dense smoke were rising above the city, as though to blot out from the eye of heaven the horrid sights beneath. In the middle of the afternoon, we sighted the scarlet and yellow towers of Helium, and a short time later, a great fleet of Zodangan battleships rose from the camps of the besiegers without the city and advanced to meet us. The banners of Helium had been strung from stem to stern of each of our mighty craft, but the Zodangans did not need this sign to realize that we were enemies, for our green Martian warriors had opened fire upon them almost as they left the ground. With their uncanny marksmanship, they raked the oncoming fleet with volley after volley. The twin cities of Helium, perceiving that we were friends, sent out hundreds of vessels to aid us, and then began the first real air battle I had ever witnessed. The vessels carrying our green warriors were kept circling above the contending fleets of Helium and Zodanga. Soon their batteries were useless in the hands of the Tharks, who, having no navy, had no skill in naval gunnery. Their small arm fire, however, was most effective, and the final outcome of the engagement was strongly influenced, if not wholly determined, by their presence. At first the two forces circled at the same altitude, pouring broadside after broadside into each other. Presently, a great hole was torn in the hull of one of the immense battlecraft of the Zodangan camp. With a lurch, she turned completely over, the little figures of her crew plunging, turning and twisting towards the ground 1,000 feet below. Then, with sickening velocity, she tore after them, almost completely burying herself in the soft loam of the ancient sea bottom. A wild cry of exultation arose from the Heliumite squadron, and with redoubled ferocity they fell upon the Zodangan fleet. By a pretty maneuver, 2 of the vessels of Helium gained a position above their adversaries, from which they poured upon them from their keel bomb batteries a perfect torrent of exploding bombs. Then, one by one, the battleships of Helium succeeded in rising above the Zodangans, and in a short time a number of the beleaguering battleships were drifting helpless wrecks towards a high scarlet tower of greater Helium. Several others attempted to escape, but they were soon surrounded by thousands of tiny individual flyers, and above each hung a monster battleship of Helium ready to drop boarding parties upon their decks. Within but little more than an hour from the moment the victorious Zodangan squadron had risen to meet us from the camp of the besiegers, the battle was over, and the remaining vessels of the conquered Zodangans were headed towards the cities of Helium under prize crews. There was an extremely pathetic side to the surrender of these mighty flyers, the result of an age-old custom which demanded that surrender should be signalized by the voluntary plunging to earth of the commander of the vanquished vessel. One after another, the brave fellows, holding their colors high above their heads, leapt from the towering bows of their mighty craft to an awful death. Not until the commander of the entire fleet took the fearful plunge, thus indicating the surrender of the remaining vessels, did the fighting cease, and the useless sacrifice of brave men come to an end. We now signaled the flagship of Helium's navy to approach, and when she was within hailing distance, I called out that we had the Princess Dejah Thoris on board, and that we wished to transfer her to the flagship that she might be taken immediately to the city. As the full import of my announcement bore in upon them, a great cry arose from the decks of the flagship, and a moment later the colors of the Princess of Helium broke from 100 points upon her upper works. When the other vessels of the squadron caught the meaning of the signals flashed them, they took up the wild acclaim and unfurled her colors in the gleaming sunlight. The flagship bore down upon us, and as she swung gracefully to and touched our side, a dozen officers sprang upon our decks, and as their astonished gaze fell upon the hundreds of green warriors who now came forth from the fighting shelters, they stopped aghast. But at the sight of Kantos Khan, who advanced to meet them, they came forward, crowding about him. Dejah Thoris and I then advanced, and they had no eyes for other than her. She received them gracefully, calling each by name, for they were men high in the esteem and service of her grandfather, and she knew them all well. "Lay your hands upon the shoulder of John Carter," she said to them, turning towards me, "the man whom Helium owes her princess as well as her victory today." They were very courteous to me, and said many kind and complimentary things, but what seemed to impress them most was that I had won the aid of the fierce Tharks in my campaign for the liberation of Dejah Thoris and the relief of Helium. "You owe your thanks more to another man than to me," I said, "and here he is. Meet one of Barsoom's greatest soldiers and statesmen, Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark." With the same polished courtesy that had marked their manner towards me, they extended their greetings to the great Thark. Nor, to my surprise, was he much behind them in ease of bearing or in courtly speech. Though not a garrulous race, the Tharks are extremely formal, and their ways lend themselves amazingly to dignified and courtly manners. Dejah Thoris went aboard the flagship, and was much put out that I would not follow, but, as I explained to her, the battle was but partly won. We still had the land forces of the besieged Zodangans to account for, and I would not leave Tarkas until that had been accomplished. The commander of the naval forces of Helium promised to arrange to have the armies of Helium attack from the city in conjunction with our land attack, and so the great vessels separated, and Dejah Thoris was borne in triumph back to the court of her grandfather, Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. In the distance lay our fleet of transports with the thoats of the green warriors, where they had remained during the battle. Without landing stages, it was to be a difficult matter to unload these beasts upon the plain, but there was nothing else for it, and so we were put out for a point about 10 miles from the city and began the task. It was necessary to lower the animals to the ground in slings, and this work occupied the remainder of the day and half the night. Twice we were attacked by parties of Zodangan cavalry, but with little loss, however, and after darkness shut down, they withdrew. As soon as the last thoat was unloaded, Tarkas gave the command to advance, and in 3 parties we crept upon the Zodangans' camp from the north, the south, and the east. About a mile from the main camp we encountered their outposts, and, as had been prearranged, accepted this as the signal to charge. With wild, ferocious cries, and amidst the nasty squealings of battle-enraged thoats, we bore down upon the Zodangans. We did not catch them napping, but found a well-entrenched battle line confronting us. Time after time we were repulsed, until towards noon I began to fear for the result of the battle. The Zodangans numbered nearly 1,000,000 fighting men, gathered from pole to pole, wherever stretched their ribbon like waterways, while pitted against them were less than 100,000 green warriors. The forces from Helium had not arrived, nor could we receive any word from them. Just at noon we heard heavy firing all along the line between the Zodangans and the cities, and we knew then that our much-needed reinforcements had come. Again Tarkas ordered the charge, and once more the mighty thoats bore their terrible riders against the ramparts of the enemy. At the same moment the battle line of Helium surged over the opposite breastworks from the Zodangans, and in another moment they were being crushed as between 2 millstones. Nobly they fought, but in vain. The plain before the city became a veritable shambles ere the last Zodangan surrendered, but finally the carnage ceased. The prisoners were marched back to Helium, and we entered the greatest city's gates, a huge, triumphal procession of conquering heroes. The broad avenues were lined with women and children, among which were the few men whose duties necessitated that they remain within the city during the battle. We were greeted with an endless round of applause and showered with ornaments of gold, platinum, silver, and precious jewels. The city had gone mad with joy. My fierce Tharks caused the wildest excitement and enthusiasm. Never before had an armed body of green warriors entered the gates of Helium, and that they had come now as friends and allies filled the red men with rejoicing. That my poor services to Dejah Thoris had become known to the Heliumites was evidenced by the loud crying of my name, and by the loads of ornaments that were fastened upon me and my huge throat as we passed up the avenues to the palace, for even in the face of the ferocious appearance of Woola, the populace pressed close about me. As we approached this magnificent pile, we were met by a party of officers who greeted us warmly and requested that Targus and his Jeds, with the Jedaks and Jeds of his wild allies, together with myself, dismount and accompany them to receive from Taros Moles an expression of his gratitude for our services. At the top of the great steps leading up the main portals of the palace stood the royal party, and as we reached the lower steps, one of their number descended to meet us. He was an almost perfect specimen of manhood, tall, straight as an arrow, superbly muscled, and with the carriage and bearing of a ruler of men. I did not need to be told that he was Taros Moles, Jedak of Helium. The first member of our party he met was Targus, and his first words sealed forever the new friendship between the races.
"That Taros Moles," he said earnestly, "may meet the greatest living warrior of Barsoom is a priceless honor. That he may lay his hand on the shoulder of a friend and ally is a far greater boon."
"Jedak of Helium,"
returned Targus,
"it has remained for a man of another world to teach the green warriors of Barsoom the meaning of friendship. To him we owe the fact that the hordes of Tharks can understand you, that they can appreciate and reciprocate the sentiments so graciously expressed."
Taros Moles then greeted each of the green Jedaks and Jeds, and to each spoke words of friendship and appreciation. As he approached me, he laid both hands upon my shoulders.
"Welcome, my son," he said. "That you are granted, gladly, and without one word of opposition, the most precious jewel in all of Helium, yes, on all Barsoom, is sufficient earnest of my esteem."
We were then presented to Mors Kajak, Jed of Lesser Helium, and father of Dejah Thoris. He had followed close behind Taros Moles, and seemed even more affected by the meeting than his father. He tried a dozen times to express his gratitude to me, but his voice choked with emotion, and he could not speak, and yet he had, as I was later to learn, a reputation for ferocity and fearlessness as a fighter that was remarkable even upon warlike Barsoom. In common with all Helium, he worshipped his daughter, nor could he think of what she had escaped without deep emotion. Chapter 27. From Joy to Death. For 10 days the hordes of Thark and their wild allies were feasted and entertained, and then, loaded with costly presents, and escorted by 10,000 soldiers of Helium, commanded by Mors Kajak, they started on the return journey to their own lands. The Jed of Lesser Helium, with a small party of nobles, accompanied them all the way to Thark, to cement more closely the new bonds of peace and friendship. Sola also accompanied Targus, her father, who, before all his chieftains, had acknowledged her as his daughter. 3 weeks later, Mors Kajak and his officers, accompanied by Targus and Sola, returned upon a battleship that had been dispatched to Thark to fetch them in time for the ceremony which made Dejah Thoris and John Carter one. For 9 years I served in the councils and fought in the armies of Helium as a prince of the house of Taros Moles. The people seemed never to tire of heaping honors upon me, and no day passed that did not bring some new proof of their love for my princess, the incomparable Dejah Thoris. In a golden incubator upon the roof of our palace lay a snow-white egg. For nearly 5 years, 10 soldiers of the Jedak's guard had constantly stood over it, and not a day passed when I was in the city that Dejah Thoris and I did not stand hand in hand before our little shrine, planning for the future, when the delicate shell should break. Vivid in my memory is the picture of the last night we sat there talking in low tones over the strained romance which had woven our lives together, and of this wonder which was coming to augment our happiness and fulfill our hopes. In the distance we saw the bright white light of an approaching airship, but we attached no special significance to so common a sight. Like a bolt of lightning it raced towards Helium until its very speed bespoke the unusual. Flashing the signals which proclaimed it a dispatch-bearer for the Jedak, it circled impatiently, waiting for the tardy patrol boat which must convey it to the palace docks. 10 minutes after it touched the palace, a message called me to the council chamber, which I found filling with the members of that body. On the raised platform of the throne was Taros Mauls, pacing back and forth with tense, drawn face. When all were in their seats, he turned towards us.
"This morning," he said, "word reached the several governments of Barsoom that the keeper of the atmosphere plant has made no wireless report for 2 days, nor had almost ceaseless calls upon him from a score of capitals elicited a sign of response. The ambassadors of the other nations asked us to take the matter in hand and hasten the assistant keeper to that plant. All day 1,000 cruisers have been searching for him, until just now one of them returns bearing his body, which was found in the pits beneath his house horribly mutilated by some assassin. I do not need to tell you what this means for Barsoom. It would take months to penetrate those mighty walls. In fact, the work has already commenced, and there would be little to fear were the engines of the pumping plant to run as it should, and as they have for hundreds of years. But the worst, we fear, has happened. The instruments show a rapidly decreasing air pressure on all parts of Barsoom. The engine has stopped. My gentlemen," he concluded, "we have at best 3 days to live."
There was an absolute silence for several minutes, and then a young noble arose, and with his drawn sword held high above his head, he addressed Taros Mauls. "The men of Helium have prided themselves that they have ever shown Barsoom how a nation of red men should live. Now is our opportunity to show them how they should die. Let us go about our duties as though 1,000 useful years still lay before us." The chamber rang with applause, and there was nothing better to do than to allay the fears of the people by our example as we went about our ways with smiles upon our faces and sorrow gnawing at our hearts. When I returned to my palace, I found that the rumor had already reached Dejah Thoris, so I told her all that I had heard. "We have been very happy, John Carter," she said, "and I thank whatever fate overtakes us that it permits us to die together." The next 2 days brought no noticeable change in the supply of air, but on the morning of the 3rd day breathing became more difficult at the higher altitudes of the rooftops. The avenues and plazas of Helium were filled with people. All business had ceased. For the most part, the people looked bravely into the face of their unalterable doom. Here and there, however, men and women gave way to quiet grief. Toward the middle of the day, many of the weaker commenced to succumb, and within an hour the people of Barsoom were sinking by thousands into the unconsciousness which precedes death by asphyxiation. Dejah Thoris and I and other members of the royal family had collected in a sunken garden within an inner courtyard of the palace. We conversed in low tones, when we conversed at all, as the awe of the grim shadow of death crept over us. Even Wooler seemed to feel the weight of the impending calamity, for he pressed close to Dejah Thoris and to me, whining pitifully. The little incubator had been brought from the roof to our palace at the request of Dejah Thoris, and she sat gazing longingly upon the unknown little life which she would now never know. As it was becoming perceptibly difficult to breathe, Taros Mauls arose, saying,
"Let us bid each other farewell. The days of the greatness of Barsoom are over. Tomorrow's sun will look down upon a dead world, which through all eternity must go swinging through the heavens peopled not even by our memories. It is the end." He stooped and kissed the women of his family, and laid his strong hand upon the shoulders of the men. As I turned sadly from him, my eyes fell upon Dejah Thoris. Her head was drooping upon her breast. To all appearances she was lifeless. With a cry I sprang to her and raised her to my arms. Her eyes opened and looked into mine. "Kiss me, John Carter," she murmured. "I love you. I love you. It is cruel that we must be torn apart, who are just starting upon a life of love and happiness." As I pressed her dear lips to mine, the old feeling of unconquerable power and authority rose in me. The fighting blood of Virginia sprang to life in my veins. "It shall not be, my princess," I cried. There must be some way, and John Carter, who has fought his way through a strange world to love you, will find it." And with my words, there crept above the threshold of my conscious mind a series of 9 long-forgotten sounds. Like a flash of lightning in the darkness, their full purport dawned upon me, the key to the 3 great doors of the atmosphere plant. Turning suddenly to Tardos Mors, I still clasped my dying love to my breast. I cried, "A fly, Jeddak! Quick! Order your swiftest fire to the palace top! I can save Barsoom yet!" He did not wait to question, but in an instant the god was racing to the nearest dock, and though the air was thin and almost gone at the rooftop, they managed to launch the fastest one-man air scout machine that the skill of Barsoom had ever produced. Kissing Dejah Thoris a dozen times and commanding Woola, who would have followed me, to remain and guard her, I bounded with my old agility and strength to the high ramparts of the palace, and in another moment I was headed towards the goal of the hopes of all Barsoom. I had to fly low to get sufficient air to breathe, but I took a straight course across the old sea bottom, and so had to rise only a few feet above the ground. I traveled with awful velocity, for my errand was a race against time with death. The face of Dejah Thoris hung always before me. As I turned for a last look as I left the palace garden, I had seen her stagger and sink upon the ground beside the little incubator. That she had dropped into the last coma which would end in death if the air supply remained unreplenished, I well knew, and so, throwing caution to the winds, I flung overboard everything but the engine and compass, even my ornaments, and lying upon my belly upon the deck with but one hand on the steering wheel and the other pushing the speed lever to its last notch, I split the thin air of the dying Mars with the speed of a meteor. An hour before dark, the great walls of the atmosphere plant loomed suddenly before me, and with a sickening thud I plunged to the ground before the small door which was withholding the spark of life from the inhabitants of the entire planet. Beside the door, a great crew of men had been laboring to pierce the walls, but they had scarcely scratched the flint-like surface, and now most of them lay in the last sleep from which not even air would awaken them. Conditions seemed much worse here than at Helium, and it was with difficulty that I breathed at all. There were a few men still conscious, and to one of those I spoke. "If I can open these doors, is there a man who can start the engines?" I asked.
"I can," he replied, "if you open quickly. I can last but a few moments more, but it is useless. They are both dead, and no one else upon Barsoom knew the secret of these awful locks. For 3 days, men crazed with fear have been surged about this portal in vain attempts to solve its mystery."
I had no time to talk. I was becoming very weak, and it was with difficulty that I controlled my mind at all. But with a final effort, as I sank weakly to my knees, I hurled the 9 thought waves at that awful thing before me. The Martian had crawled to my side, and with his staring eyes fixed on the single panel before us, as he waited for the silence of death. Slowly the mighty door receded before us. I attempted to rise and follow it, but I was too weak. "After it!" I cried to my companion. "And if you reach the pump room, turn loose all of the pumps. It is the only chance Barsoom has to exist tomorrow." From where I lay, I opened the 2nd door, and then the 3rd, and as I saw the hope of Barsoom crawling weakly on hands and knees through the last doorway, I sank unconscious to the ground. Chapter 28. at the Arizona cave. It was dark when I opened my eyes again. Strange, stiff garments were upon my body, garments that cracked and powdered away from me as I rose to a sitting posture. I felt myself over from head to foot, and from head to foot I was clothed, though when I fell conscious at the little doorway I had been naked. Before me was a small patch of moonlit sky which showed through a ragged aperture. As my hands passed over my body, they came in contact with pockets, and in one of these a small parcel of matches wrapped in oiled paper. One of these matches I struck, and its dim flame lighted up what appeared to be a huge cave, toward the back of which I discovered a strange, still figure huddled over a tiny bench. As I approached it, I saw that it was the dead and mummified remains of a little old woman with long black hair, and the thing it leaned over was a small charcoal burner, upon which rested a round copper vessel containing a small quantity of greenish powder. Behind her, depending from the roof upon rawhide thongs and stretching entirely across the cave, was a row of human skeletons. From the thong which held them stretched another to the dead hand of the little old woman. As I touched the cord, the skeletons swung to the motion with a noise as the rustling of dry leaves. It was the most grotesque and horrid tableau, and I hastened out into the fresh air, glad to escape from so gruesome a place. The sight that met my eyes as I stepped out upon the small ledge which ran before the entrance of the cave filled me with consternation. A new heaven and a new landscape met my gaze. The silvered mountains in the distance, the almost stationary moon hanging in the sky, the cacti-studded valley below were not of Mars. I could scarce believe my eyes, but the truth slowly forced itself upon me. I was looking upon Arizona from the same ledge from which 10 years earlier before I had gazed with longing upon Mars. Burying my head in my arms, I turned, broken and sorrowful, down the trail from the cave. Above me shone the red eye of Mars, holding an awful secret, 48 million miles away. Did the Martian reach the pump room? Did the vitalizing air reach the people of that distant planet in time to save them? Was my Dejah Thoris alive, or did her beautiful body lie cold in death beside the tiny golden incubator in the sunken garden of that inner courtyard of the palace of Tardos Moles, the Jeddak of Helium? For 10 years I have waited and prayed for an answer to my question. For 10 years I have waited and prayed to be taken back to the world of my lost love. I would rather lie dead beside her there than live on earth all those millions of terrible miles from her. The old mine, which I found untouched, has made me fabulously wealthy, but what care I for wealth? As I sit here tonight upon my little study overlooking the Hudson, just 20 years have elapsed since I first opened my eyes upon Mars. I've seen her shining in the sky through the little window by my desk, and tonight she seems calling me again as she has not called me before since that long dead night, and I think I can see across that awful abyss of space a beautiful black-haired woman standing in the garden of a palace, and at her side is a little boy who puts his arm around her as she points into the sky towards the planet Earth, while at her feet is a huge and hideous creature with a heart of gold. I believe that they are waiting there for me, and something tells me that I shall soon know. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I am the Casual Deathworlder, your host, and this has been the conclusion of Edgar Rice Burroughs' A Princess of Mars. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. If you enjoyed it, please consider dropping a comment down below and maybe hitting those like and subscribe buttons, possibly checking us out on Patreon. Every little bit helps. As always, a huge shout out goes to my buddy Gregor. Thank you very much, buddy. I could not do this without you. And a huge shout out to my Tier 4 patrons on Patreon, Russ of the Frozen North and Newsack. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Okay, I still have not quite decided what exactly I'm going to do with the Wednesday slot. However, I believe what I am going to do next is a story that's been done quite a few times by a number of people but the author himself has said, sure, why don't you do it too? And that would be Lablana Metadon, one of my favorite stories. Okay, and I am very sorry for the lateness of this final episode. Real life can be a bit of a bitch sometimes. My apologies. Okay, question. Who's got the question? Okay, fishing. How many of y'all like to go fish? What do you prefer, stream and river fishing, lake fishing, or saltwater fishing? Leave your answers in the comments down below. And until next time, be safe, be well. I love you all.